Israel's recent military skirmish with Iran and Hezbollah in Syria focused world attention again on the Middle East. Could it lead to a bigger war between the Ayatollah and the Jewish state? What's Donald Trump's plan to prevent a big regional conflict there? Does he even have a plan? What about North Korea? After the big show of unity at the Olympics, will Kim Jong Un resume his threats and missile launches? Could that lead to fire and fury on the Korean Peninsula? Well, joining us is Dr. Hal Brands. He's Distinguished Professor at Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And he's author of the book American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump. Dr. Brands, does this president have a grand foreign policy strategy, or is he just kind of winging it?
I think he has a series of basic geopolitical beliefs that he's had for 20 to 30 years in some cases, which mainly add up to the idea that the United States should not play the role it's played in the world for the past 70 years, since World War II, because when the United States acts as the primary provider of international security, when it anchors the international economy, it simply allows other countries to free ride and to exploit the United States. And you can see this on the president's views on things like alliances, free trade agreements, and other issues. But he's had a hard time translating those views into a coherent program of policies, in part because some of the president's own views are contradictory, but also because he has surrounded himself almost by necessity with a group of advisors who really don't share his view of international affairs at all. And so the result is that you've had an awkward and unstable mix of what you might think of as the president's America First impulses with the more mainstream or traditionalist views of his advisors.
Well, I want to get into that a little more in a little bit here, but I know the president has worked hard to draw Sunni Arab states into a quiet alliance with Israel against Iran. So what do you think of that strategy? Is it a good one?
I think in theory it makes a fair amount of sense, and it recognizes that there is more strategic convergence than divergence between Israel and many of America's Arab partners, particularly in the Persian Gulf. But unfortunately, the way that this administration has gone about it has sometimes been counterproductive. And so the example I would give is the way in which the president, at least, seemed to be egging on the Saudis and the Emiratis and going after Qatar back in June 2017 at the outset of a standoff that's persisted to this day. And the idea was that doing so would force the Qataris to get serious about cracking down on financing terrorism and force them to distance themselves from Iran. But unfortunately, it's had precisely the opposite effect. It's pushed Qatar closer to Iran because Qatar sees itself as having fewer geopolitical options these days.
Well, and the recent shoot-down of the Israeli F-16 fighter jet and the IDF airstrikes on targets in Syria, how likely are we to see more of this in the future? What should the U.S. response be to prevent a big regional war in the Middle East?
So I think we are quite likely to see more of this in the future because as ISIS is defeated, particularly in Syria, the various parties to that conflict are going to be reminded of the fact that they dislike each other almost as much as they disliked ISIS. And so certainly there's going to be continuing tension between Israel and between Iran as Iran consolidates its position in Syria. I think one of the major problems in U.S. foreign policy these days is that the United States is going to find it hard-pressed to restrain actors in that conflict because it's quite clear that we don't actually have a coherent Syria strategy at this point. So you have had the Secretary of State, for instance, say that the United States is going to leave troops in Syria more or less indefinitely as a way of pushing back against Iranian influence. But you've had the Secretary of Defense say that the United States is starting to draw down its presence in Syria. And it's not at all clear that even if the United States were to leave 2,000 to 3,000 troops in Syria, it would be sufficient to take on Iranian influence in the country. And so this is a case where I think you've seen a fairly incoherent U.S. policy that's unlikely to bring about the result we might like.
Well, more of what you're saying, conflicting views within the administration regarding North Korea. The president's fire and fury comments were not well received by diplomats around the world. But is taking a hard line against Kim Jong Un a good strategy, one that will lead to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? What do you think?
So there's a bipartisan record of policy failure on North Korea over the past 25 years. And so this was inevitably going to be a problem that the Trump administration had to confront. And I think that the administration has actually done some fairly constructive things. They've been fairly effective in ramping up the diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea through additional sanctions, for instance. But I think there are two basic problems. So one is that the president sometimes can't seem to get out of his own way. And so when he gets up and talks about fire and fury or totally destroying North Korea, it has the effect of switching the focus from the destabilizing actions that North Korea is taking to the destabilizing rhetoric of the American president in a way that is not helpful. And the other problem is it's just that it's not clear whether any president would be able to solve the problem of North Korea if solving it means getting to complete and verifiable denuclearization. North Korea has clearly decided that nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantee of regime security. And so I'm not quite sure what the level of pain we would have to inflict on them short of war would be in order to get them to give that up.
So a few options there. Back to the America First. You had mentioned earlier, do you think there's a better grand foreign policy strategy? How likely is it that some of the president's cabinet members can influence his thinking, help shape the strategy? Of course, they have to be of one mind as well. And which secretaries do you think will likely have the most influence on the president?
So I think the basic grand strategy we ought to be following is essentially the grand strategy we've followed for the past 70 years, which is a grand strategy that is premised on the idea that the United States can be most prosperous and secure when we help like-minded countries be prosperous and secure. And so we have worked to construct an overarching international order that would protect our interests and our values. And I think that has proved fairly effective over time. And I think that many of the president's advisors would agree with that sentiment. And so what you've seen over the past year is that they have tried to move the president from his own more radical instincts toward more traditional policies. They've tried to ensure that the United States continues to enhance deterrence on NATO's eastern flank, for instance. And I think Secretary Mattis at the Department of Defense has been critical in that respect. I think Secretary Tillerson has been less effective, but has made some important contributions. And so I think they have had a constructive effect on American foreign policy. The trouble is that there is a huge gap between what the advisors believe and what the president believes, and in some cases between what the president believes and what U.S. policy is. And that gap creates great uncertainty as to what America's intentions are.
And maybe even misunderstanding at times with our allies and our adversaries. Well, Dr. Hal Brands, distinguished professor and author of the book American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump. We look forward to that book, and we thank you for your insights.